It's very interesting talking about REBT. There are some people might say it's hard to do a show about just one simple perspective. Well, REBT is not simple, but about one perspective on psychology. But there are a lot of, as I've discovered, a lot of different ways in which one can take a discussion regarding it. So this week's episode is different than last week's because it's not just Michael and myself, but we are also joined by David Ramsey Steele, who co-wrote a book with Michael. And I really don't want to say much more because I don't want to take Michael's thunder away. But we will be discussing some of David's opinions about various things relative to the book, REBT, so on, so forth. So first and foremost, David, thank you for joining us.
Welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Very glad to have you. And Michael, I think I've spoken long enough. Please do take it away.
Okay, well, I'm very happy to have my co-author, David Ramsey Steele of 3-Minute Therapy, on with us because we haven't spoken much just together about REBT or David's relationship to the book or those kinds of things. So I have a lot of questions to ask you, David. But first, by way of introduction of David, I want to mention that David has written many, many excellent books on many varied topics. So David's latest book is called Mystery of Fascism, and which is a collection of his greatest hits, as he calls them, or a lot of his interesting, diverse essays. And David and I wrote a book called Therapy Breakthrough together, discussing the rise of psychotherapy in the U.S., the influence of Freud, and how Albert Ellis got involved and changed the course of the psychotherapy movement, probably forever. David has also written Atheism Explained, and perhaps, David, your earliest book, or maybe you have one before this, From Marx to Mises.
Right. I bet you've left out my best book, which is Orwell, You're Orwell.
Oh, thought you were going to say 3-Minute Therapy, but okay,
no,
I stand corrected.
You did mention 3-Minute Therapy a long time ago, but you did mention it.
Right, exactly.
So
David,
yes, my best book is Orwell, You're Orwell, which is a book about George Orwell.
Okay, great. So a lot of variety in those books. I did want to say also about working with David, the way we divided the work was sort of division of labor and comparative advantage. I wrote the dry first draft about the principles of REBT and how I applied it to various clients, and then David went through it and added lots of interesting anecdotes, made it very interesting. And when people tell me what a good read it was, that's really to David's credit, if I may say.
This discussion is going very well.
Right. Well, it's downhill from there. Now, David, what interested you initially in co-authoring a book on rational emotive behavior therapy?
Well, I was already interested in the topic because it was first mentioned to me, and I must say before that I was totally ignorant of it. It was first mentioned to me by our mutual friend, Jeffrey Rogers Hummel, and he explained it very briefly. So I was somewhat interested. And then I had a conversation with you, Michael, and what struck me immediately was the title that you had, which I thought was a great title. You have to remember this was a few years after the huge runaway success of a book called The 1 Minute Manager.
Right.
So I immediately thought 3-Minute Therapy was a great title. I mean, I think that, as Michael just said, we've co-written 2 books on psychotherapy. The second one, Therapy Breakthrough, I think had a lot to do with the ideas in it. The first one, 3-Minute Therapy, all the fundamental ideas were Michael's. And I was learning about REBT as I was essentially doing a writer's job of trying to make it simple, direct, instantly comprehensible and entertaining not more than 90% of the ideas came from Michael.
Yes, and actually, my modesty requires me to say that the ideas really don't come from me, because I got all the ideas from Albert Ellis, who devised rational emotive behavior therapy in the 50s and was a pioneer in the psychotherapy movement and changed the course of psychotherapy as a result of his involvement in it. Would you agree, David?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think Albert Ellis came up with these ideas before anybody else did, and he developed them very well. I think as a writer, he was probably a bit unfortunate. He had a tendency to repeat himself a lot, so if you take some of the later people, like Aaron Beck, they were better at appealing to intellectuals than Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis had a kind of proletarian approach, which I think probably hurt the reputation of his theory.
Yeah, and Aaron Beck also had a research arm because he was at, I believe it was the University of Pennsylvania.
That's right.
So he
right.
did.
Yeah,
he did. Yeah.
So he was able to appeal to the public just like Albert Ellis, but he also had this very finely tuned sort of kind of entry into the academic world, and he was able to afford, because he was a professor of psychology at a well-endowed university, to do all kinds of experiments and things that other people wouldn't have found so easy. So he was a good. Aaron Beck was a good self-promoter in that sense, and he covered all the angles, both popular and academic.
Yeah, although I think Albert Ellis, I'd give the weight to Albert Ellis in popularizing the approach among lay people, because he wrote many self-help books, and I don't know that Aaron Beck wrote any, that made the rounds, and some, I think, Guide to Rational Living actually got on the New York Times bestseller list. So that was a great job of popularizing the ideas.
Yes.
When I assume that one of the reasons you wanted to be part of presenting these ideas in a book form was that you really liked them. Did you have any reservations, or do you have any reservations to any of the ideas in REBT?
I grew gradually more to be more in agreement with it as we worked on the book. I think there was one reservation I had that I still have a little bit of, and that is, I think that in psychotherapy there is something analogous to a placebo effect. In other words, if you listen to someone's problems and then give them some sort of analysis of their problems, you're giving them something to think about, and that may take their mind off their problems and make them feel less a victim, because they've got something to think about other than just moping about their problems. So I think there is that. I think that all psychotherapy, even radically mistaken psychotherapy, could do some good simply by giving people something to think about.
Yes, and there's also the placebo effect that I'm sure plays a role with many people and therapists, that people think, well, I'm working with a therapist and he has a lot of confidence in these ideas. They're probably good, so of course I feel better.
Yes, right.
Although Albert Ellis was a great proponent of the idea that the purpose of therapy is to get better, not so much feel better. And this is a good criticism of a lot of conventional therapy, where people feel better after a session or knowing that this authority figure likes them and doesn't criticize them, but they really don't learn strategies, tools, concepts that they can use themselves in their own life. And one of the assets of REBT is teaching the clients how to be their own therapist. We teach them concepts and tools they can use on their own for the rest of their lives. They're not dependent on a therapist. By the way, along those lines, yeah. Joseph, along these lines, you said REBT is not simple. I have a different view. I think REBT is simple in the sense that it starts with a few basic, simple premises, like your emotions come from your thinking and your disturbed emotions come from absolutistic thinking, demands, must, should, supposed to's, have to's. And the solution is to identify your demands, question, challenge, and contradict those irrational thoughts. So that's kind of simple, but it's not easy to do. It takes a lot of practice and deeper understanding of what those ideas mean.
I'll just say that when I said it was simple, I didn't mean simplistic, but sorry, I'm screwing up my words here. When I said that it's not simple, I didn't mean to say that it was, terribly complex or anything like that. What I meant to say is that it's not simplistic, like something that, I guess adding
yes.
2 and 2 together as 4 would be. So, but no, I do understand what you're saying entirely. And as a layman, it does fascinate me that someone would, who is a psychologist, would try to create a psychological perspective, philosophy, whatever one should like to call it, in which the psychologist eventually becomes irrelevant, because that would undercut the psychologist's income eventually. Before you move on to anything else, Michael, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, yes, I think that's a good point, Joseph. I think therapists obviously have a financial interest in keeping their clients, not helping them become their own therapist. So there are various strategies that they can use to let the therapy drag on, like talking about your childhood and your relationship to your parents and your relationship to your friends and things like that. So I think there is that financial incentive there for therapists.
Right. I mean, I think that one of the great contrasts between REBT and psychodynamic therapy is that if you fall into the clutches of a psychodynamic therapist, you're going to be given the impression that even though you may be able to make some progress, your problems are actually vast and abysmal, and there's no getting to the bottom of them. Because the whole sort of underlying notion of psychodynamic therapy is that there is this vast unknown region of the mind where all kinds of strange things happen, and these strange things can cause you problems and misery and so on. REBT, or indeed all cognitive behavioral schools of psychotherapy, they tend to get rid of all that. They tend to, you're not bothered by that anymore because in 3-minute therapy, there are a lot of examples of particular clients and what their problems were and how they were dealt with. Excuse me, my cough is very bad, but and that helped to elucidate, the basic skeleton of the theory in a way that I hadn't fully understood when I embarked upon this. So the examples, I think, the thing about 3-minute therapy, it's full of practical examples, and they're actual cases drawn from Michael's clinical experience. And they're stated simply and evocatively. As I got to understand these, I appreciated the full force of the arguments for the REBT theory.
Yes, and speaking of the full force of the arguments, I think a somewhat unique aspect of 3-minute therapy is Chapter 14, which is basically FAQs, frequently asked questions. So we present the hard questions given about REBT and to REBT therapists, objections,
right,
and then we answer them quite succinctly, of course, and clearly. And I often refer clients to that chapter after they've just read a few chapters and have familiarized themselves with REBT because some of these questions are likely to be raised in their mind. So this is a very handy chapter to give to therapists or people and clients and people who are familiar with REBT.
Right, yes.
David, do you care to say anything about how you've used this in your life or how you've benefited from this either personally or with other people that you've told about it?
Well, I certainly learned to a great extent how to avoid having that fear, or if the fear starts, getting rid of it quickly through.
Well, David, I think you cut out on my side when you mentioned the fear. So would you repeat that?
Yeah, a fear of public speaking. I've always wanted to do public speaking. It's like a natural thing that I've always wanted to do. But at the same time, I used to be very panicky about it. I think it's the clarity of thinking that arises from an REBT approach to it is very helpful. And I've given a lot of talks over the past few years, and I haven't had much in the way of panic or anything like that. I must say that I've never had to address a meeting of more than a few hundred, and I'm not quite sure how it would work out on the bigger scale. But certainly, my fear of that kind of thing is much less than it used to be. Although here I think I would mention something else that's really nothing to do with REBT. It's just a matter of me, and you may not want to hear it. And that is, I think that the fact that we're soon going to die is a great comfort, because it puts all these little worries into perspective. And you think, well, fuck me, if I can't get through this next half hour, how ridiculous is that? When in a few years I'm going to be dead, and soon everybody's going to have forgotten me. So that's a particular view that I have. That if I start feeling sort of really anxious about something, I tell myself, well, this is so silly. In the course of human history, you're just a little dot, and you're soon going to be gone. And 100 years from now, nobody's going to give a damn about what you're worrying about right now. So, so that's a personal thing. It's not really not REBT. It's death therapy.
Yeah, well, I do some death therapy also, and that is when people are anxious, say they have a fear of public speaking, which is actually the most common fear people have, even greater than the fear of death. And one of the things I say is, look, if you give a talk and you're anxious, the worst that happens is you die, and if you die, you'll be out of your pain, and we'll make you a splendid funeral. So that's another perspective on.
Well, but
therapy.
That's not the worst. That's not the worst thing that can happen, is it? I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that you become a gibbering lunatic and a spectacle of a gibbering lunatic. So that's what you're afraid of. You're not afraid of dying. You're afraid of something much worse than dying.
Right. I agree. And there's intractable pain for many years, which is, I think, worse than dying. But this is meant somewhat humorously.
Yes,
and,
right.
I wouldn't want to say the worst thing that could happen is you become a raving lunatic and you're in intractable pain forever. So So face the anxiety. I could try that, but also by bringing up death the way I do, it also I'm tempting to put things in perspective and
right.
that one day you'll be dead, just as you're saying one day you'll be dead. So this is very, very different and very less momentous than your death.
Right.
To what extent, David, I find myself, maybe because I'm a therapist, I find myself proselytizing this to others, trying to help them, and maybe sometimes to their chagrin. But to what extent do you try to spread the word in your other
Well, I think what's happened to me is just because of my particular kind of mental habits and general orientation is that I'm always trying to convince people of things on a much grander theoretical scale. So basically, one of the things that learning about REBT did to me was it made me a much more effective anti-Freudian and, for that matter, anti-Jungian propagandist, because I'm always looking for arguments with people who believe in the Oedipus complex or archetypes or something like that, and I'm always looking to argue with them and disabuse them of these notions, so you know. I do argue sometimes for REBT, but more often I just argue against Freud or against Jung and against psychodynamic theorems in general.
Right, and two of them that you argue very convincingly against in Therapy Breakthrough is one, the existence of the unconscious as Freud devised it, and the existence of repression. Do you want to say a few things to put the lie to those two things?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think actually very recently I've started to realize that in my own view, there's something which many people listening to me might think is a contradiction. And of course, unlike Walt Whitman, I don't contain any contradictions. But so that would be, in some contexts, I appear to be saying there is no such thing as the unconscious, whereas in other contexts, I seem to be saying it's very important. And the context in which I say it's very important, I don't know if you know of someone called Guy Gerenzer. He's a psychologist who argues that a lot of things that people take to be irrationalities are really heuristics, valuable heuristics that we use to get along with limited information. And he lays a lot of emphasis on unconscious processes. And I think unconscious processes are very important. I think it's inconceivable that we could have a mind and be conscious, in fact, without a lot of unconscious stuff going on to begin with. But where I think Freud went wrong, and where I think Freud actually took several steps backward from people like William James, who had a much clearer understanding, Freud wanted to make the unconscious like a conscious mind, except that it was shrouded in darkness. So he thought there was this part of us that had motives and hopes and fears and thoughts even, that I think is quite wrong. The way I now like to think of the true unconscious, it's like imagine having a little hand calculator. Now imagine that there are dozens of these and they're part of your brain, and they do all these calculations when they're called upon to do them. Now they're not conscious, just like a $10 calculator isn't conscious, but they do a lot of work, which, if we were to think of it in these terms, would be mental work. But it's not mental work. It's all at the level of physiology, not at the level of consciousness. So that's my view, that there is an unconscious, but it's not a mind. It's not filled with these. So it doesn't have any ideas. It's just like a lot of calculating machines.
Yeah, so to summarize what you're saying, and correct me if I have this wrong, that the Freudian unconscious, where you repress these ideas because they're threatening, because they're ideas about wanting to have sex with your mother and being afraid of being castrated by your father, the Freudian unconscious makes no sense.
Right.
But there's a reasonable sense of the unconscious.
It's just as ridiculous as it seems at first glance.
Right. You're not aware. Yeah, go on. You're not aware of, and I think the term unaware is clearer than unconscious. You have ideas you're not aware of. You're not aware of what your kidney is doing now or your left elbow. You're not aware right now of what the capital of France is, but you can bring that up, just like a calculator brings up how much 2 times 2 is. So those are two very different senses.
The naive reaction to Freud is, well, that's ridiculous. I never wanted to have sex with my mother. And then the Freudian says, but the reason that you reject this is precisely because it's true, and you're resisting it. Yes. Well, that's a great catch-22, isn't it? So,
that shows it's not a science, it's not falsifiable.
Right. It's a circular kind of reasoning, because if you did say, well, maybe I did want to have sex with my mother, that would be confirmation. But if you say, what nonsense, I didn't want to have sex with my mother, that's confirmation too.
Exactly.
God, what a terrific, it's what Popper called a reinforced dogmatism, where everything confirms it.
As we get into the last few minutes of this discussion, I guess it's hard to figure out exactly what to inquire about, because so many different things have been raised here. And I think you all, each of you, pretty much answer any questions that might be brought up about any of this. But I think I'll just throw something over to Michael, and then obviously David can respond if he likes. Looking at REBT and then looking at older things like Freud or Jung, so on and so forth, could it possibly be that there is no right, correct, however one should like to put it, psychological perspective? Maybe a Jungian perspective works well for someone, then a Freudian perspective works well for someone else, and then finally REBT would be good for a different individual. Could this really be it? And maybe there is no beneficial, destructive, good, bad perspective on human psychology, or everything has to be individualized.
That's a good question. And I think there are a couple of aspects to your question, Joseph. One is right or wrong as measured by reality and experimental testing, but I don't think you're asking about that. You're asking about right or wrong in terms of what's helpful.
Correct.
And is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that REBT or the cognitive behavior therapies that it spawned are significantly more helpful than the older Freudian and Jungian therapies, and I think that's one reason they tend to be fading away. And most therapists I speak to these days says either I do CBT or RBT.
Are you still there?
Yeah. Who, me? Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
I can hear you now. Yeah. There was a break. I didn't hear for like a few seconds.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of its helpfulness, and I think that for some reasons that David and I gave earlier, some people could feel they're helped and maybe even do better in their life by these older therapies. But I think if they are helped and if they are doing better in their life, as Albert Ellis explained, it's because they've changed their thinking. So the bottom line, when you feel helped and you're doing better because you're thinking better about what you're doing. So I think REBT even explains when
another break.
Are doing better.
There were a lot of breaks there. Are you there?
I'm here, yeah.
Yeah, there was. You kept cutting out from me.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to the great age of psychoanalysis, which I suppose was the 1930s through the 50s. So you get the tail end of it in the first season of the TV show Mad Men, where there was this huge thing called psychoanalysis, and people who had significant amounts of money would go twice a week to an analyst, and they would spend a lot of the time in silence, just sitting there, and the analyst would be trying to disguise the fact that he kept dozing off, and this would go on for years. And occasionally there would be little sporadic applications of a free association method and things like that, all to help that person described as the patient discover himself and find out what his inner repressions were. And first of all, it's all false. These repressions didn't exist. They were constructed in the course of the so-called analysis. The whole theoretical system is bogus, and it's not true. But secondly, is this a worthy life for someone to spend hours every week for years on end, perpetually groping into the depths of his unconscious to find things that don't really exist? It strikes me, that if people had understood that this was just a completely foolish endeavor and had said, no, instead of doing this, I'll learn mathematics or painting or tap dancing or whatever, that would be a better use of their life. So I'm not sure what you could say. It helped people to find a purpose, but the purpose was to search for a purpose, and that search was endless and never got anywhere.
Well, I think we have reached the end of our time, and it was a very good discussion. I enjoyed it. I principally listened, but there was a lot of good stuff to go around on both sides. And it goes without saying that I hope those listening to this, most of the conversation will just be, it obviously is audio only, but I hope that those listening to this are in some way, shape, or form enlightened about human psychology, which is, I think, a very a good thing, to say the least.